On the morning of April 1st, 1984, a 28-year-old man named James Sire slowly opened his eyes and looked down. He was lying flat on his back, and his entire body was covered in a thick layer of cold, heavy snow. But as he blinked to clear his vision, he noticed that a lot of that white snow had turned a deep, bright red. It looked like blood, and it was everywhere around him. James tried to take a deep breath in to calm himself down, but as soon as he did, his chest exploded in a wave of agony so intense that he nearly passed out again. He felt as if his entire rib cage had been completely crushed. James lay there, barely able to breathe, and he began moving his tongue around inside of his mouth to see if he could speak or make a sound. But as he did, he realized there was some kind of weird, gritty substance in his mouth, along with several very sharp, loose objects. He gathered up what was in his mouth and spit it out onto the snow. When he looked down, he realized what it was. It was a mixture of dark red blood and several of his own shattered teeth. James began to panic, and he tried to lift up one of his arms to wipe his face, but it would not move. It was completely paralyzed. He tried to move his other arm, and this time it did move, but the small movement sent such a horrific jolt of pain through his shoulder and neck that he began to cry out in absolute agony. He was dealing with a blinding, full-body pain, and he had absolutely no idea where it had come from. He looked around him, squinting through the glare of the snow, but he could barely understand where he was or what had happened to him. The landscape was just white, rugged, and completely empty. But then James looked up kind of right behind him, and he saw this enormous, jagged, snow-covered mountain towering high into the sky. James had no idea what mountain this was, but as he stared up at its massive peaks, a thought popped into his head. He thought, I must have attempted to climb that mountain. James was a self-described climbing bum, which really just meant he did not have a permanent home. He lived out of his car most of the time, and he traveled all around the world seeking out the most dangerous and challenging mountains for him to climb. He lived for the thrill of the ascent, and he had spent years training for extreme conditions. And so, as James lay there in the freezing cold, racking his brain and trying to remember what led him to this snowy slope, suddenly it all just came flooding back to him. He remembered that he was here in the Canadian Rockies, and he was not alone. He had traveled here with his best friend, a man named Richard Whitmore. The two of them had planned this trip for months, and they had attempted to climb this particular mountain. It was an 11,000-foot tall mountain called Mount Deltaform, known for its incredibly steep routes and unpredictable weather. James remembered that as they were making their way up the steep face of this mountain, they had suddenly heard a terrifying rumbling sound. Before they could even react, they were hit by a massive avalanche. Now, James did not really remember what happened once the snow and ice slammed into them. But it would turn out that he had fallen, along with his friend Richard, about 140 stories, as this avalanche swept them off the mountain face and carried them all the way down to the base. For reference, that is taller than the Empire State Building. It was a miracle that James was even conscious after a fall of that scale, and so, as James is lying there remembering that terrifying rush of snow, he began looking around frantically for his friend Richard, hoping with everything he had that maybe Richard was okay and nearby, and that they could work together to get out of this desperate situation. And sure enough, after searching the immediate area with his eyes, James looked over and he saw a crumpled figure lying in the snow. It was obviously another person, and they were only a short distance away. James instinctively tried to sit up to go over to his friend, but as soon as he attempted to lift his torso, he felt that blinding, white-hot pain shoot through his body again. He was totally wrecked. He had broken bones, internal injuries, and he could not stand up. But James really wanted to go see his friend. He needed to know if Richard was okay. So he rolled onto his side, and through the excruciating pain, using his one good arm, he slowly crawled his way over to Richard, dragging his useless legs behind him through the deep snow. For a second, as he got closer, he thought maybe his friend was alive, that maybe Richard had also survived this epic, impossible fall. But as James finally reached him and looked down at Richard, his heart sank. He could see that Richard's chest was not moving at all. There was no breath, his neck was twisted at a horrific, unnatural angle, and so was his back. James reached out with his one good hand and touched him, but there was no pulse. He knew instantly that his friend Richard was dead. James collapsed into the snow next to his friend's body, feeling an unbelievable wave of anguish, sadness, and sheer terror. This was the only other person out here. They were deep in the wilderness, miles and miles away from any kind of civilization. And the worst part was, James knew it would be at least 4 days before anybody back home even noticed they were missing. That was when they were scheduled to return. Nobody was looking for them yet. Now James is lying in the freezing snow, unable to stand, barely able to breathe, and badly injured. He began to think, what am I going to do? There is no way I can survive out here for 4 days. And pretty quickly, James adopted a very dark but realistic mindset. He thought, unfortunately, you are going to die here. This was actually something James had always thought might happen to him eventually. He knew the risks of extreme mountain climbing, and he had always assumed a mountain would end up killing him. And here he was, realizing that, yep, that is exactly what is about to happen. I am going to die right here in the snow next to my best friend. And so, James just kind of lay there, completely resigned to his fate, literally waiting for his life to slip away. After about 20 minutes of lying in the freezing cold, his body began to go numb. The shivering was starting to stop, which is a very bad sign because it means you are entering the advanced stages of hypothermia. His brain was getting foggy and he was drifting off. But suddenly, James heard a voice coming from right behind him. He startled and he looked up as a woman walked right up to him. He had no idea where she had come from. She looked down at him and in a very clear, firm voice, she said, "You can't give up, you have to try." James was totally caught off guard. He had no idea how another person could be out here in this desolate area, especially right after an avalanche. But there was something so incredibly calming and authoritative about this woman and the way she was talking to him that without any hesitation, it was like James's whole mindset about this situation completely changed. Suddenly, he was not ready to just lie there and die. Because of this woman, he was going to fight with everything he had to survive. After James moved his head to look back toward this woman, she looked at him and said, "Put your coat on." Now, James's coat was packed away inside of his gear bag, which was lying in the snow nearby. Despite the excruciating, agonizing pain, James used his one arm that still worked and propped himself up. He reached over, dragged his pack toward him, and pulled his coat out. It was a massive struggle. Every movement felt like his bones were grinding together, but very painfully, he managed to slip the coat over his broken and damaged arms and zip it up. Once the coat was on him and he was protected from the freezing wind, the woman spoke to him again. She said, "Now take a sip of water." James, without any hesitation, reached over to his pack and grabbed his water bottle. He unscrewed the top and took a sip, despite how painful it was to swallow. The cold water stung his totally shattered mouth and his broken teeth, but he managed to get it down. Then, after James put the water bottle back down, the woman looked at him very calmly and told him, "Okay, now disconnect yourself from Richard's body and then use the tree right here to pull yourself up." James and Richard had been roped together for the climb, which was standard safety procedure, and that rope was still connecting them. James reached down with his one good hand and untied the safety rope, freeing himself from his deceased friend. Then he looked over and saw a small, sturdy evergreen tree growing nearby out of the rocks. Using his one good arm, James grabbed onto a low branch of the tree, and with a massive, agonizing effort, he managed to hoist his broken body up onto his totally destroyed legs. He was standing, but he could not believe he was even upright. The pain was blinding, but here he was, up on his feet. The woman looked at him and said, "Okay, it's time to move." And so, James began walking away from the mountain base, heading in the direction of the trail. And this mysterious woman just followed along right behind him. For a very long time, James trudged through the knee-high snow. He was barely able to take a single step without a wave of blinding pain coursing through his entire body. He wanted to collapse. He wanted to just fall down and sleep. But every single time he began to stumble or slow down or look like he was going to give up, the woman behind him would very calmly urge him on. She would say, keep going, keep moving." And so James kept pushing forward, step after agonizing step, solely because of her voice. Finally, after about 4 hours of this horribly painful trek, James came over a small ridge, and he saw something ahead. It was the campsite that he and his friend Richard had built before they had walked over to the mountain to begin their climb. It was a beautiful sight. James quickly began moving toward his tent, which was still pitched and standing in the snow. He knew that inside of that tent, there was a warm, dry sleeping bag, some water, and some food. He just had to get inside. But as he made his final steps toward the tent, he stopped himself. He remembered his guide, the woman who had walked with him for 4 hours and saved his life. He wanted to thank her. He turned around to speak to her and thank her for pushing him onward. But when James turned, there was absolutely no one there. He was completely alone. He looked down at the snow behind him, expecting to see her footprints next to his. But when he looked at the ground, there was only one single set of bloody, dragged footprints leading all the way back into the distance toward the mountain face. They were his footprints. This guide, this woman who had spoken to him, walked with him, and given him instructions, she did not exist. There were no other tracks in the snow. James was totally unsettled by this. He was deeply confused and did not know what to make of it. But he knew that right now the priority was just to survive. He was freezing and his body was shutting down. He made his way over to the entrance of his tent and attempted to get inside of it. But his hands were so cold and so badly beaten up from the fall and the crawl that he could not get his fingers to grip the zipper. He could not even get the tent open. He spent several long, desperate minutes trying to work the zipper. Finally, he managed to use a tool from his gear to hook the zipper and pull it open. But once he crawled inside, he faced another hurdle. He could not open up his sleeping bag. His hands were just completely useless, and his body was shivering violently. He thought, okay, I will go back outside and make a fire. That will be enough to keep me warm. But as he crawled back out, his body began failing him completely. He could not strike a match. He could not gather the kindling. He was too weak and too close to death, right as James is lying there by the unlit fire pit. Realizing that despite making it all the way to this campsite, he was still going to die because he could not use any of his equipment, he began to hear voices in the distance. Right away, James got worried. He thought the voices he was hearing were just another hallucination, like the woman who had guided him. He thought his brain was just playing tricks on him as he died. But sure enough, just a second later, 3 cross-country skiers came around the corner of the trail, and they saw James lying in the snow. Amazingly, one of these 3 skiers was a very experienced mountain guide, and another one of them was a registered nurse. As soon as they saw James, they ran over and saw that he was dying of hypothermia and severe trauma. The nurse immediately jumped into action. She built a massive fire for him, got him comfortable, and put warm, dry clothes on him from their own packs. Meanwhile, the mountain guide took off on his skis to find a spot with a signal to call for help. A couple of hours later, a rescue helicopter arrived at the campsite. They loaded James inside, airlifted him to a nearby hospital, and after several surgeries and months of physical therapy, James would make a full recovery. However, it would take James years before he finally opened up to anyone about the mysterious vanishing woman who had literally saved his life. He knew that without her talking to him, giving him those simple, step-by-step instructions and urging him to keep moving, he would have just laid there next to his friend Richard and died of hypothermia in 20 minutes. But James was terrified to bring her up because he was afraid people would think he had gone crazy or suffered brain damage during the fall. But when he finally did work up the courage to tell his story to some fellow climbers, he quickly learned that he was far from the first person to experience this exact phenomenon. It turns out having an invisible, mysterious person appear and help you survive during a highly traumatic, life-threatening event is actually common enough that it has its own scientific name. It is called the third man effect. The third man refers to this mysterious, vanishing presence that steps in to guide people through extreme survival situations when they are at their absolute limit. Another famous example of someone who experienced the third man effect was a man who was the very last person to escape the Second World Trade Center Tower on September 11, 2001 in New York City. He was trapped in a stairwell, completely disoriented by the smoke and debris, and he was convinced he was going to die. But suddenly he heard a very clear, calm voice telling him exactly which direction to go, guiding him down the stairs step by step until he made it safely out of the building right before it collapsed. As soon as he got outside, the voice was gone. Whether the third man effect is actually something supernatural or just a very powerful trick of survivor psychology, we still do not know. James, who is both an atheist and a scientist, has said that he does not believe the woman who saved him was an angel or connected to any kind of religion. Instead, he just said, it was a presence that I desperately needed at the time that saved my life, but that is the absolute extent of my understanding. At about 1:30 in the afternoon on August 8, 1999, a park ranger named Lance Matson stood frowning down at a dusty red Mazda sedan inside of an otherwise empty parking lot. This parking lot was located just outside of Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. Lance was looking at the car because he knew the 2 men who owned this red Mazda had taken out a one-night backcountry permit to go hiking and camping inside of Rattlesnake Canyon, which is one of the most isolated and rugged parts of the entire national park. Rattlesnake Canyon is basically just a single, long, scrubby trail that winds through a harsh desert landscape with high canyon walls towering on either side. It is a beautiful but incredibly unforgiving place. In order to get access to Rattlesnake Canyon, visitors are required to go to the park's visitor center and literally fill out physical paperwork. This is so the park rangers know exactly who is out there, where they are planning to go, and most importantly, when they are supposed to be back. That way, if a group does not return on time, the rangers can go out and check on them. The 2 men who owned the Mazda had done exactly that. They had filled out all the paperwork, but now Lance was noticing that they had not returned at the end of their permit. In fact, their permit had expired 3 days ago. They had stayed out in Rattlesnake Canyon for an additional 3 nights without permission. Now, Lance was not immediately concerned for their safety because people did this kind of thing from time to time. Sometimes hikers just decided to stay out longer, or they forgot to check out when they left. It was more like Lance was annoyed because now, as part of his duties, he was going to have to walk out into the blistering heat of Rattlesnake Canyon, track these 2 guys down, and figure out what was going on. So, Lance and a park volunteer who was working with him that day grabbed their gear and began walking down the trail in the direction of Rattlesnake Canyon. After walking less than a mile along the trail, Lance and the volunteer looked up ahead. Just off the side of the trail, sitting right out in the open desert, there was a green and maroon tent pitched on the dirt. Lance immediately assumed that this had to belong to the 2 men who owned the red Mazda. Very quickly, Lance's annoyance was replaced with relief. He thought, well, this is great. It turned out to be incredibly easy to find these guys. He figured he would just walk over, see what they were doing, and either get them to pack up and head back to their car, or help them extend their permit the right way if they wanted to stay longer. But as Lance and the volunteer stepped off the main trail and began walking over to the green and maroon tent, they started to notice that something was very off about the scene. First of all, as they got closer and closer to the tent, they were hit with a horrible, chemical burning smell that was hanging in the hot desert air. It smelled like burnt plastic or fuel. Then they noticed that all over the dry ground surrounding the tent, there were these little charred, blackened bits of burned trash. It looked like someone had tried to start a fire right next to the tent using plastic and gear. Finally, when Lance and the volunteer arrived right in front of the tent, they looked down at the entrance flap. It was zipped completely shut from the inside. But as they stood there, they could see that the fabric of the tent was moving. There was clearly something or someone moving around inside, but whoever it was, they were not making a single sound. There was no talking, no groaning, nothing. Lance and the volunteer looked at each other, and both of them were suddenly very nervous. Their hearts were racing, and they had a bad feeling about what they were about to find. Lance reached down, grabbed the zipper of the tent flap, unzipped it, and pulled it open. When he looked inside, he was immediately hit with a massive wave of fear and anxiety. 3 days earlier, on August 5th, 1999, a 26-year-old man named David Coughlin woke up inside his sleeping bag. He was inside that same green and maroon tent in Rattlesnake Canyon. As soon as David sat up, he smiled. Right outside the tent, he could hear the familiar sounds of his best friend, Rafi Kodakan, making breakfast and rustling through their gear to prepare for that morning's hike. David and Rafi were on what they had been calling the trip of a lifetime. 6 days earlier, they had packed up their things, left their hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, and embarked on a massive road trip. They were traveling more than 2,000 miles west, sleeping at cheap campsites and motels along the way. Their final destination was a university in Santa Barbara, California, where David was about to start graduate school to get his master's degree in environmental engineering. But before school started, they wanted to turn the cross-country drive into an epic vacation. Carlsbad Caverns National Park was easily their favorite spot so far. Unlike the other commercial campgrounds they had stayed at, which were crowded and small, Carlsbad Caverns felt massive and wild. It was 47,000 acres of pure desert. For David and Rafi, whose normal everyday lives in Boston were pretty safe, structured, and boring, this felt incredibly thrilling. They felt like real explorers out in the Wild West. As David sat up inside the tent, listening to Rafi get things ready outside, he noticed that he was already sweating. It was still very early in the morning, but the heat in New Mexico was already intense. David reached over, grabbed his water bottle, and took a small sip. As he drank, he thought about the park ranger who had helped them fill out their backcountry permit the day before. That ranger had made a really big deal about water. He had sat them down and told them they needed to bring at least 1 gallon of water per person for every single day they planned to be out in the canyon. But after they had walked away from the ranger, Rafi, who had way more camping experience than David did, laughed it off. He told David that the ranger was totally overkilling it and that they did not need to carry all that heavy water for just a simple one-night stay. So, instead of bringing 2 massive heavy gallons of water into Rattlesnake Canyon, Rafi had packed just 3 16-ounce plastic bottles of water for the 2 of them. For reference, that is approximately 6 times less water than what the park ranger had strongly recommended. The night before, they had already used one of those 16-ounce bottles to boil some hot dogs for their dinner. And now, the bottle David was currently holding and drinking from was already half empty. They were down to the very last of their water supply. But David was not worried about it. He and Rafi were planning to hike out of Rattlesnake Canyon that morning, get back to their red Mazda in the parking lot, and continue driving toward California. They knew they had set up their camp very close to the trailhead, so it was going to be a very short, easy hike back. David got out of his sleeping bag, crawled out of the tent, and joined Rafi. By 8:30 in the morning, they had packed up their tent and their gear, and the 2 friends set off on the trail, heading back toward the parking lot. They walked at a very comfortable, leisurely pace for about an hour. As they walked, they kept their eyes open for the trail markers, which were little stacks of white rocks called cairns. They saw several of these stacks, so they knew they were on the right path. But after walking for a full hour, they realized they should have reached the parking lot by now. They stopped, looked around, but they could not see the road or their car. Still, they were not worried. They knew they had to be incredibly close. They figured they just had a few more minutes of walking left. They each took a small sip of water and kept going, but after walking for another 2 to 3 hours, they still had not found the parking lot. In fact, the landscape around them started to look completely unfamiliar. There were no more trails, and they had not seen a stack of white rocks in hours. They were completely lost in the desert, and the temperature was climbing rapidly. It was now midday, and the sun was beating down on them, trying to stay calm. David and Rafi sat down in the dirt, pulled off their heavy backpacks, and pulled out their topographical map. They unfolded it and began studying it, hoping to find a landmark. But the problem was, neither man actually knew how to read a topographical map. All the swirling contour lines and symbols just looked like a confusing mess to them. They could not figure out where they were on the map, and looking at it was just making them more frustrated. They folded the map up and put it away. They stood up, thinking they should just keep walking in the general direction they thought the parking lot was. But as soon as they stood up, the sheer heat and exhaustion hit them. The sun was directly overhead, and it was brutal. They realized they could not keep walking in this heat without collapsing. They looked over and saw a section of the canyon wall where some scrubby bushes were hanging off a ledge, creating a small patch of shade. They walked over, sat down in the dirt under the shade, and just stared out at the desert in silence. Both men knew they were in serious trouble. They had no food left, and they were completely out of water. They knew the 3 16-ounce bottles had been a massive, terrible mistake, but just as they were sitting there feeling hopeless, the sky suddenly turned dark. Huge storm clouds rolled over the canyon, and it began to rain. It was a sudden, violent desert downpour. David and Raffi jumped up, laughing with relief. They tilted their heads back to catch the raindrops in their mouths, and they began licking the water off the flat rocks and leaves around them. It was not a lot of water, but it was enough to wet their dry throats and give them a massive boost of hope. They felt like they could survive this after all. Once the storm passed, they decided their best move was to keep moving and try to find the parking lot before it got dark. They walked for hours, pushing through the brush, but as the sun began to set, they still had not found any signs of civilization. They realized they were going to have to spend another night in the canyon. By now, they were starting to feel real deep fear. They found a dry, sandy gully, set up their green and maroon tent, and crawled inside. Neither of them could sleep. They sat there in the dark, trying to comfort each other. They said, "Look, the park rangers are bound to have noticed we are missing by now. Our permit was only for one night, and we did not check out. They have to be looking for us." But in the back of their minds, they were not sure if that was true. They did not know how long it took for rangers to actually initiate a search. As they were talking, Raffi suddenly looked out the tent flap and gasped. Far off in the distance, up on a high ridge across the canyon, he saw what looked like bright headlights moving across the horizon. David looked, and he saw them too. They both immediately thought, "That is a road. There is a highway right up there. All we have to do is climb up to that ridge tomorrow morning, and we are saved. We do not even need to wait for the rangers." This discovery filled them with a massive amount of hope. They forgot about their hunger and thirst, crawled into their sleeping bags, and fell asleep, eager for the morning light so they could hike to the road and go home. The next morning, they woke up early, excited to make their way toward the ridge where they had seen the lights. But instead of packing up all their heavy gear and carrying it up the steep climb, they decided to leave their tent and backpacks behind at the campsite. David pulled out a small journal from his pack, and on the first page he drew a crude map of where their camp was and wrote a note. He wrote down their names, their ages, where they were from, and their contact information. He also wrote that they were completely out of food and water, and that they were hiking up to the ridge to find the road. He left the journal open on the ground inside the tent, hoping that if a rescue party came by, they would see the note and know where to find them. Dave and Raffi set off toward the ridge. But as they walked, they realized the climb was much harder than it had looked from their camp. They had to walk up a steep, gradual incline for hours in the direct sun. When they finally reached what they thought was the top, they realized it was just a false peak, and there was another ridge behind it. To get up to the next level, they had to climb through thick patches of cactus and scramble up loose, slippery gravel gullies that were almost completely vertical. By this point, they were completely exhausted. They had not had any water in over 24 hours, and their bodies were starting to fail. But they kept pushing, thinking about the road. Finally, after a brutal climb, they reached the very top of the highest ridge. They stood up, looked out, and their hearts completely shattered. There was no road, there was no highway, no cars, nothing. It was just miles and miles of empty, flat, barren desert stretching out to the horizon in every direction. There was no sign of life anywhere. They realized that whatever lights they had seen the night before, they were not headlights. They might have been a reflection or a star, or maybe they had just hallucinated them out of sheer desperation. As the two men stood there in stunned, heartbroken silence, David looked up. High above them, a single black buzzard was flying in slow, patient circles in the sky. It felt like a terrible omen, as if the bird was just waiting for them to collapse so it could eat them. David wanted to turn around immediately and go back to their tent, where they at least had shelter from the sun. But Raffi was stubborn. He insisted that maybe if they walked just a little bit further along the ridge, they would find something. They walked for another hour, but the heat was too intense, and they were barely able to put one foot in front of the other. Finally, Raffi gave up, and they turned around. They painfully made their way all the way back down the steep, cactus-covered cliffs and walked back to their campsite. As they walked, they kept praying that when they got back, they would see a park ranger standing by their tent. But when they finally stumbled into the camp, it was completely empty. Their tent was just as they had left it, and David's journal was still sitting untouched on the ground inside. Their spirits were completely broken. The next day was Saturday, August 7th. This was their fourth day in the desert, and their third full day without water. Their physical condition had deteriorated rapidly. Raffi had gotten extremely sick to his stomach after trying to drink his own urine in a desperate attempt to hydrate. David was suffering from horrific stomach cramps and diarrhea, which was likely caused by eating unripe, raw prickly pears he had picked off a cactus. His leg muscles were also seizing up and cramping so badly that he could no longer stand or walk. They were completely trapped at their campsite. Knowing they could not hike out, they tried to do whatever they could to signal for help. They tried to use loose rocks to spell out a massive SOS on the ground. But after they managed to gather enough rocks to make the letter S and the letter O, they both collapsed from exhaustion. They did not have the physical strength to carry any more rocks to finish the final S later that afternoon. Raffi took his sleeping bag, soaked it in the leftover camp stove fuel, and lit it on fire. He was hoping to create a thick plume of black smoke that a ranger or a passing plane might see, but the air was too hot and still and the smoke did not rise very high. Instead, it just lingered around their camp, creating a horrific, suffocating chemical smell of burning polyester and fuel. With the sun beating down on them, they could not take the heat inside the tent anymore. They noticed that the dirt and rocks underneath the tent felt slightly cooler than the air. In a daze, they took a knife, cut the entire bottom floor out of their tent, and lay directly on the hard, loose rocks inside, trying to get any relief from the heat. By that evening, when the sun finally went down and no rescuers had arrived, they both realized they were likely going to die there. David grabbed his journal, flipped to a new page, and wrote a heartbreaking goodbye note to his girlfriend. He told her how much he loved her and that he was sorry he was not going to make it. Then, Raffi took the journal and wrote his own notes to his family. In his note, Raffi wrote something very disturbing. He wrote that he would not let the buzzards get them, and that they would make sure their bodies remained intact for their families to find. After they finished writing, they crawled out of the floorless tent into the cool night air. They sat together in the dark and they began to have a very quiet, emotional, and matter-of-fact conversation about what they were going to do. At one point, David began crying and screaming out into the empty canyon out of pure despair. But by the end of the conversation, the two best friends had reached an agreement. They made an unthinkable decision that really could only ever be made in a situation of extreme, hopeless survival. Once they were both on the same page, they crawled back inside the zip tent and closed the flap. It was the very next morning, August 8th, when Ranger Lance Matson and the volunteer discovered the camp. When Lance unzipped the tent and looked inside, he saw Raffi. He was lying on his side on the loose rocks, wearing nothing but a pair of dirty green shorts. He was incredibly thin, sunburned, and looked like he was on the absolute brink of death. Raffi looked up at Lance with hollow eyes and said, "Please tell me you have some water." Lance immediately handed him a water bottle, and Raffi began gulping it down. Lance, knowing there were supposed to be two hikers, looked around the small tent and said, "Hey, where's the other guy you were with? Where is David?" Raffi, without pausing his drinking, casually pointed his finger out of the tent toward the canyon wall behind where Lance was standing. Lance and the volunteer turned and looked, but they did not see anyone. There was just empty dirt and rock. Lance turned back to Raffi and asked, "Are you sure he is over there?" Raffi, with a completely blank, emotionless expression on his face, pointed again and said, "Yes, he is right over there." Lance got up, walked out of the tent, and walked in the direction Raffi had pointed. But before he reached the canyon wall, he stopped. He noticed a strange pile of loose rocks on the ground that had clearly been arranged by human hands. With a growing sense of dread, Lance knelt down and began pulling the rocks away. Underneath the first layer of stones, he saw David's pale, lifeless face. It would turn out that during their intense conversation the night before, David and Raffi had agreed that they could not bear the thought of dying slowly and painfully of dehydration or being eaten by wild animals. David had pulled out his small pocket knife and tried to slit his own wrist, but the blade was too dull and he could not cut deep enough to kill himself. So, David had looked at his best friend Raffi and said, "You are going to have to kill me, and then you have to kill yourself." Raffi had agreed to do it. They went back inside the tent and David lay down on his back. He pulled his shirt up to expose his chest. Raffi took his 4-inch pocket knife, placed the tip against David's ribs, and tried to push it in. But he could not force himself to break his friend's skin. David, who was in extreme physical and mental agony, began screaming at Raffi, telling him to just do it to help him end his suffering. Finally, Raffi gathered his strength, pushed the knife through David's ribs, and stabbed him in the heart. David did not die instantly, so Raffi covered his mouth and nose and kept pressure on the knife until David finally stopped breathing. Once David was dead, Raffi used the very last of his physical energy to drag David's body out of the tent and cover him with rocks to protect him from the buzzards. Then, too weak to kill himself, Raffi crawled back inside the tent, lay down on the dirt, and waited to die. But just a few hours later, Lance Matson had found him. The most tragic part of this entire story is that when the park rangers mapped out the location of the campsite, they discovered that the tent was located just a 15 to 20 minute walk away from the parking lot where their red Mazda was parked. If they had walked in the right direction for just a quarter of a mile, they would have been saved. 9 months later, on May 11th, 2000, Raffi pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Throughout his trial, Raffi insisted that he only killed David because David had begged him to, and that it was a mercy killing. David's family actually believed Raffi's story, and they supported him in court, asking the judge for leniency. Ultimately, the judge agreed that it was a unique and tragic survival situation, and although Raffi was sentenced to 16 years, he was released after serving just 16 months in prison. On December 7, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside of a quiet hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany. She was staring anxiously at the nurse who was wrapping a blood pressure cuff around her arm. When the machine finished its reading, the nurse looked at the numbers and told Diane that her blood pressure was still far too high. Diane sighed and leaned back against her pillows. She was incredibly upset, but at the same time, she was not really shocked. After all, she had come to the hospital because she knew something was wrong. Diane was an American citizen living in Germany because her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap, was stationed at the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base. That morning, Diane had suddenly started bleeding. Since she had a tragic history of miscarriages in the past, she had panicked, thinking she was losing her baby, and had rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Fortunately, after running some tests, the doctors had told her that the baby seemed to be okay and that the bleeding was not immediately life-threatening. However, as a strict precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for at least a week of complete bed rest so they could monitor her closely. Diane was relieved the baby was safe, but the stress of the situation was keeping her blood pressure dangerously high. The nurse finished recording Diane's vitals, packed up her equipment, and left the room, shutting the door behind her. This was the first time Diane had been completely alone since she had arrived at the hospital that morning. As she lay there in the quiet room, she found herself feeling incredibly anxious about the future. Just then, she heard the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps coming down the hallway outside. Suddenly, her hospital room door busted open and her husband, Stephen, rushed inside. Stephen looked terrible. His face was extremely pale, his eyes were bloodshot and watery, and he looked deeply distressed. He hurried over to the side of Diane's bed, knelt down in the floor, took her hand in his, and asked her how she was doing. It had been an incredibly difficult few months for Diane and Stephen. Just a short time earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce. She felt like Stephen had become emotionally distant, and she realized she just did not love him anymore. Stephen did not want the divorce. He believed they still had a good relationship and that they could work through their issues, but he could see how unhappy Diane was. Stephen had tried to be very gentlemanly and supportive about the split. He had even gone with Diane to see the military chaplain on the base, where they made official arrangements for Diane to be sent back to the United States to live while Stephen finished his tour of duty in Germany. But before Diane could pack up and leave, she discovered she was pregnant. Diane knew that Stephen desperately wanted to reconcile, especially now that he knew she was having a baby. He wanted to stay together and be a father to the child. But Diane knew in her heart that it was not going to work. Their marriage was dead and she needed to be firm with him. So as Stephen sat there kneeling by her bed holding her hand, Diane looked at him and said, "Stephen, we cannot get back together. Even though I am pregnant, this does not change anything. We are still getting a divorce." Stephen just shook his head slowly, as if he was not even listening to her or did not want to argue about it. He looked at her and said, "Look, I just want to be your friend right now. Let me help you. Why don't I go back to your house on the base, gather up some of your clothes, books, and toiletries, and bring them back here to the hospital so you can be more comfortable during your stay?" Diane wanted to tell him no. She felt uncomfortable having her soon-to-be ex-husband going through her things, and she wanted to keep her distance. But as she looked at Stephen's sad, desperate face, she could tell that he really truly wanted to do something helpful for her. Against her better judgment, she relented. She said, "Okay, Stephen, if you want to go get my things, I would really appreciate it." Stephen smiled, stood up, and gave Diane a long, tight hug. He whispered that he would be right back, and then he turned and walked out of the hospital room. A few hours later, at around 5 o'clock that evening, the telephone on the bedside table next to Diane began to ring. Diane reached over and answered it. On the other end of the line was a man named Gregory Glover. Gregory was Stephen's very best friend on the military base, and he was also a close friend of Diane's. Gregory told Diane that he was just calling to check in on her. He said he had heard she was in the hospital due to some pregnancy complications and wanted to make sure she and the baby were doing okay. Diane thanked him and told him that the doctors said the baby was fine, but she just needed to rest. Then Gregory's tone became more serious. He told Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He explained that earlier that morning he had driven Stephen to work, and during the drive, Stephen had completely broken down. He said Stephen had poured his heart out, crying about how much he loved Diane and how desperate he was to win her back. Gregory said Stephen seemed incredibly worked up and unstable about the whole situation, But before Diane could even respond to Gregory's warning, the phone line suddenly went completely dead. Diane pulled the receiver away from her ear and stared at it, confused. She put it back to her ear and said Gregory's name several times, but there was no sound. The line was totally cut. Diane hung up the phone, assuming that the hospital's phone system had just glitched or that Gregory's cell signal on the base had dropped. She figured he would call her right back, but 30 minutes went by and the phone did not ring. Diane began to feel an uneasy sensation in her stomach. Suddenly, out in the hallway, Diane heard the sound of someone running. The footsteps were fast and heavy, and they were coming straight toward her room. The running stopped right outside her door. Diane turned her head toward the entrance. The door was flung open with a violent crash. And what Diane saw standing in the doorway caused her to freeze in absolute paralyzing horror. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had driven straight to her apartment on the military base. He had brought along a black and blue athletic gym bag made by the company Head. He unlocked her front door, went inside, and began walking through the rooms, picking up items he thought she would need at the hospital and putting them in the bag. Eventually, Stephen walked into Diane's bedroom. As he stood there, he was suddenly overcome with an intense wave of grief and anger. He looked around the room and saw framed photos from their wedding day still sitting on the dresser. Then he noticed a card lying face down on her bedside table. It was a card he recognized. Looking at these things made Stephen feel incredibly depressed about the end of his marriage. Instead of continuing to pack her clothes, Stephen began pacing back and forth across the bedroom floor, his mind racing. He started thinking about how he could convince Diane to take him back. He thought about buying her a beautiful gift or making some grand, romantic gesture that would prove to her how much he loved her. As Stephen was pacing, he happened to look down at his head gym bag, and suddenly, it was like a light bulb went off in his head. He felt completely inspired. He knew exactly what he needed to do to solve his problems. Without another thought, Stephen reached down and grabbed a large, sharp knife that was sitting on the mantelpiece in Diane's bedroom. He threw the knife into the gym bag, zipped it shut, and walked out of the apartment. When Stephen got outside, his entire demeanor had changed. He was no longer crying or looking depressed. In fact, he had a massive smile on his face. And he was casually whistling a tune as he walked down to his car, got inside, and drove off. But instead of driving back toward the hospital to deliver Diane's things, Stephen began driving in strange, erratic loops all around the Sickles Army Airfield Base. He was driving slowly, constantly scanning the sidewalks and buildings to the left and right, as if he was hunting for something or someone. At one point during his search, Stephen drove past the base mess hall. He saw dozens of soldiers walking in and out of the cafeteria to get their dinner. He thought, yes, that is where he will be. The person I need to find is going to be in there. Stephen parked his car, grabbed his gym bag, and rushed inside the mess hall. He walked through the crowds of soldiers, searching the tables, but he could not find the person he was looking for. Frustrated and angry, Stephen turned around and walked back out of the building. But as he was walking back to his car in the parking lot, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. He looked over toward the sidewalk near the main road and saw a public phone booth. Inside the glass booth, there was a man standing with his back to the road, holding a telephone receiver to his ear. Stephen recognized the man instantly. It was the exact person he had been searching the base for. Stephen's face twisted into a crazed, determined expression. He gripped the strap of his gym bag and began walking in a straight, fast line toward the phone booth. 30 minutes later, back at the hospital, Diane was staring at her open door. Her husband, Stephen, was standing in the doorway. He was breathing heavily, his clothes were disheveled, and he had a terrifying, manic smile on his face. He looked completely out of his mind. In his right hand, he was clutching the head gym bag. Stephen walked slowly into the room, keeping his eyes locked onto Diane's face. He did not say anything at first. He just stood at the foot of her bed, smiling. Then he reached down, unzipped the gym bag, and reached his hand inside. He pulled out his special gift. The thing he had been searching the base for, and the thing he had finally found inside that phone booth. Stephen walked up to the side of Diane's bed, held the object right up in front of her face, and screamed, "Look! Look what I brought you!" "Look!" Diane looked at what her husband was holding, and she began screaming in absolute, primal terror. It would turn out that earlier that morning, when Stephen had knelt by Diane's hospital bed and begged her to get back together, and Diane had firmly told him no, she had also told him a devastating secret. She had told Stephen that the real reason they could never reconcile was because the baby she was carrying was not his. This news had completely destroyed Stephen, but he had hidden his rage and pretended to be calm so he could leave the hospital and go to her apartment. While he was in her bedroom packing her bags, he had looked at that card lying face down on her bedside table. Stephen knew who had sent that card. It was his best friend, Gregory Glover. Gregory was always coming over to their apartment, always talking to Diane, and always telling Stephen how lucky he was to have such a beautiful, wonderful wife. Suddenly, everything clicked in Stephen's mind. He realized that the friend who had been giving his wife cards, the friend who had driven him to work that morning and told him to just let the divorce happen and move on, was actually Diane's secret lover. Gregory Glover was the father of Diane's unborn child. Stephen felt an unbelievable, burning sense of betrayal. His best friend and his wife had been sleeping together behind his back. That was when Stephen decided he was going to get a special gift for Diane to show her what happens to people who betray him. He had taken the knife from her bedroom, driven around the base until he spotted Gregory inside that phone booth, and run over. Gregory was in the middle of his phone call with Diane, checking to see if she was okay. When Stephen suddenly ripped the phone booth door open, Stephen grabbed Gregory, dragged him out onto the concrete sidewalk, and began stabbing him repeatedly with the knife. Gregory tried his best to fight back and defend himself, but Stephen was in a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled madness. He kept hacking and stabbing until Gregory stopped moving. With dozens of horrified soldiers and onlookers watching in shock, Stephen stood over Gregory's body, caught his breath, and calmly said, "I am sorry." Then he knelt down, used the knife to decapitate Gregory, and put his severed head into the head gym bag. Stephen then drove to the hospital, walked right past the security desk, and entered Diane's room. He pulled Gregory's severed head out of the gym bag and placed it directly onto Diane's bedside table, forcing her to look into the dead eyes of her lover. Diane's screams alerted the hospital staff, who rushed into the room and tackled Stephen to the ground. Throughout the struggle, Stephen remained completely calm, waiting for the military police to arrive and arrest him. Stephen Schapp was tried by a military court-martial for premeditated murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Late on the afternoon of March 22, 2015, a 29-year-old woman named Denise Huskins was sitting in her apartment when she heard her cell phone buzz with a text message. When she saw the sender's name on her screen, she immediately felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The text was from her on-again, off-again boyfriend, a 30-year-old man named Aaron Quinn. Right now, at least in Denise's mind, they were very much off, and she wanted to keep it that way. But Aaron was texting her, saying he was feeling incredibly stressed and that he really desperately needed to talk to her in person. He asked her if she would please come over to his house. It was a Sunday evening, and Denise was looking forward to a quiet night alone in her apartment in Vallejo, California, which is a city located in the San Francisco Bay Area. She really did not have the emotional energy to go over to her ex-boyfriend's house and have another long, draining talk about their relationship. She texted him back saying she was already settled in for the night and that whatever he wanted to talk about would just have to wait, but as soon as she hit send, her phone buzzed again. Aaron sent another text begging her to change her mind. Denise sat on her couch staring at the screen, trying to decide what to do. Denise and Aaron had met the previous summer. Denise had recently moved to Vallejo all the way from Boston, Massachusetts to take a highly coveted job at Kaiser Hospital. Denise was incredibly smart and driven. She had earned her PhD in physical therapy, and Kaiser Hospital had one of the best clinical programs in the country, especially for patients recovering from severe brain and spinal cord injuries. Aaron also worked at Kaiser Hospital as a physical therapist, which is how they met. Aaron was tall, athletic, with dark hair, and he was known for being very charming and a great cook. Denise was a beautiful blonde with blue eyes who loved outdoor activities like hiking and running. The two of them had been immediately attracted to each other, and they quickly fell into a very passionate, intense relationship. But despite how well they got along, their relationship was complicated from the very beginning. Before meeting Denise, Aaron had been engaged to be married to another woman. However, his fiancée had cheated on him, which completely devastated Aaron, and he had ended the engagement. It was during this painful rebound period that he met Denise. Denise sometimes felt like she was just a rebound for Aaron, but they had such a deep connection that she wanted to make it work. They officially started dating in the fall of 2014, but in March of 2015, their relationship had hit a massive roadblock. Denise had accidentally discovered that Aaron was still sending text messages to his ex-fiancée, and in those texts, Aaron was literally begging his ex to take him back and get back together with him. Denise felt incredibly betrayed and hurt. She told Aaron that they were completely finished and she moved out. But it was incredibly hard for her because she still loved Aaron and she was miserable without him. And now, here he was, blowing up her phone on a Sunday night, begging her to come over. Denise typed out a long text message back to Aaron. She wrote, "Look, I do not feel comfortable coming over to your house. It is the same house you bought and shared with your ex-fiancé, and being there just reminds me of everything. We can talk another time. Right now, if you want to win me back, you need to court me. Take me out on real dates, show me I can trust you, because right now, there is zero trust between us," Aaron wrote back immediately. He said, "I understand, and I'm absolutely willing to do whatever it takes to win you back. I love you, Denise, but please, I have something incredibly important to tell you, and I do not feel safe or comfortable talking about it anywhere else besides my house. Please, just come over tonight. It is extremely important." At first, Denise held her ground and said no. But Aaron kept texting, and his persistence actually made Denise feel desired and special. She began to soften. Finally, she sighed and texted, "Okay, fine, I will come over." She got off the couch, got dressed, and called their favorite local pizza parlor to order a couple of pizzas to bring with her. She grabbed an overnight bag, drove to the pizza place, picked up the food, and then drove over to Aaron's house on Mare Island, which is a peninsula in Vallejo. At around 5:30 p.m., Denise pulled into Aaron's driveway. She grabbed the hot pizza boxes and her bag, walked up to the front door, and knocked. The next day was Monday, and both Denise and Aaron were scheduled to work their normal shifts at Kaiser Hospital. But at around 7 o'clock that morning, Aaron called the hospital's clinical director and said he was sick and would not be coming in. Shortly after, Denise's boss received a text message from Denise's phone. The text said that a sudden family emergency had come up and that she would be out of the office for the entire week. When Denise's boss read the text, he was immediately highly suspicious. Denise was an incredibly reliable, dedicated employee who never missed work. More importantly, her boss knew that Denise was currently applying for a highly prestigious orthopedic residency fellowship. The application deadline was that Friday, and Denise still had a massive amount of paperwork and clinical logs to complete at the hospital before she could submit it. If she was going to be gone for the entire week, she would miss the deadline and lose her chance at the fellowship. It made absolutely no sense that Denise would just walk away from this opportunity unless something was seriously wrong. Her boss replied to the text telling her he understood and to let him know if she needed anything. But as the hours passed, Denise did not reply. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, a 911 call came into the Vallejo Police Department dispatch. The caller was Aaron Quinn. Aaron's voice was incredibly slurred, thick, and he sounded highly disoriented. He began babbling a very confusing, bizarre story about men breaking into his house and kidnapping Denise, and he begged the police to help him. Because 2 police officers happened to be patrolling nearby on Mare Island, they arrived at Aaron's house within 2 minutes of the call. When Aaron opened the front door to let them in, the officers immediately noticed several highly alarming things. First, Aaron was clearly under the influence of some kind of substance. His eyes were glassy, his speech was slow and slurred, and he was stumbling. Second, as they walked into the kitchen, they saw at least a dozen empty beer bottles lined up along the counter. Third, the entire house smelled incredibly strong of bleach and harsh cleaning chemicals. One of the officers looked at Aaron and asked, "Are you on drugs right now?" Aaron shook his head and said, "Yes, I am, but the kidnappers are the ones who drugged me. They forced me to drink something." The officers looked at each other, highly skeptical. They told Aaron they were going to search the house. They went upstairs to the master bedroom, where the smell of cleaning products was even stronger. The room was unnaturally clean. The carpet had been freshly vacuumed, and the bed had been completely stripped of its blankets and pillows, leaving only the white fitted sheet on the mattress. As the officers searched the room, one of them stopped and pointed at the bed. Right in the middle of the white fitted sheet, there was a single, quarter-sized drop of fresh red blood. The officers went back downstairs, confronted Aaron, and told him to tell them exactly what had happened. Aaron proceeded to tell them a story that sounded like it was straight out of a Hollywood movie. Aaron said that at around 3 o'clock that morning, he and Denise were asleep in bed when they were suddenly awakened by multiple intruders. He said the intruders were wearing tight black wetsuits, tactical vests, and military gear. He said they were carrying handguns, tasers, and had high-powered flashlights and red laser pointers attached to their weapons. Aaron claimed the men immediately ordered them to get out of bed and lie face down on the floor. They tied Aaron's hands and feet with zip ties and put a pair of swim goggles over his eyes. The inside of the goggles had been painted black, so he was completely blind. They did the same thing to Denise. Then, Aaron said the intruders put headphones over their ears. Through the headphones, a pre-recorded audio track began to play. The recording played calm, soothing instrumental music, and a professional-sounding male voice spoke to them. The voice told them to remain calm, that this was a professional organization executing a robbery, and that if they cooperated, they would not be harmed. Aaron said the men then moved him and Denise into separate rooms. They demanded their banking information, online passwords, and PIN numbers, which both Aaron and Denise gave them out of sheer terror. Next, Aaron claimed that a man who claimed to be a doctor entered the room. He felt Aaron's pulse, took his blood pressure, and then used a syringe to inject a liquid sedative into Aaron's neck. Before Aaron passed out, the men told him they were taking Denise with them. They told Aaron that they had set up security cameras inside his house, and that if he tried to call the police or leave the house before they gave him permission, they would watch him on the cameras and kill Denise. Aaron said he fell asleep from the drugs, and when he finally woke up hours later, he managed to cut his zip ties with a knife, saw Denise was gone, and called 911. After Aaron finished his story, the officers just stared at him. It was the most ridiculous, unbelievable thing they had ever heard. Wetsuits, goggles, tape-recorded instructions, a doctor taking blood pressure. The officers immediately suspected that Aaron had murdered Denise. They figured they had gotten into an argument about his ex-fiancée, Aaron had snapped and killed her, and then spent the morning cleaning up the crime scene with bleach, which explained the strong chemical smell and the stripped bed. Then he had drank a bunch of beers to calm his nerves, and had made up this absurd kidnapping story as an alibi. They told Aaron he was coming with them to the police station for questioning. The Vallejo police launched a massive investigation. They brought in search dogs, search and rescue teams, and even dive teams to search the waters around Mare Island for Denise's body. At the station, detectives grilled Aaron for hours. They also brought in Denise's roommate, who confirmed that Denise and Aaron had a very volatile, unhappy relationship and had recently broken up. This made the police even more convinced that Aaron had a motive to hurt her. But as the detectives dug deeper, the case only got stranger. Aaron claimed the kidnappers had demanded a ransom of $8,500. The detectives thought, why would a professional kidnapping ring risk federal prison to kidnap a woman and only ask for $8,500? It was a tiny amount of money for a kidnapping. Furthermore, when they checked Aaron's bank accounts, they saw that just 2 hours before he called 911, he had called his credit card company and tried to secure an emergency cash advance of $8,500, claiming he needed it to buy a boat. The police thought this was a terrible cover story for him trying to hide money. A police doctor also examined Aaron and noted that his pupils were heavily dilated. While this can be a sign of being drugged, the detectives began to wonder if Aaron was actually suffering from a sudden onset of schizophrenia. Aaron was 30, which is the prime age for schizophrenic episodes to manifest, and his bizarre, highly detailed story about wetsuit-wearing high-tech intruders seemed like a classic paranoid delusion. By Monday night, the Vallejo police realized they were out of their depth and they called in the FBI. The FBI operators gave Aaron a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. After being told he failed, Aaron refused to speak any further and demanded a lawyer. By Tuesday, March 24th, Denise's face was all over the national news. The media had descended on Vallejo, camping outside Aaron's house. Then, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle received an anonymous email. The email was from the self-proclaimed kidnappers. They wrote that Denise was safe and would be returned soon. Attached to the email was an audio file. The reporter played the file, and it was indeed Denise's voice. She read the current day's news headlines as proof of life, but what shocked investigators was how Denise sounded. Her voice was completely calm, flat, and unemotional, as if she was reading a grocery list. She did not sound like a terrified woman being held hostage by armed men. Even more suspicious, the email had been sent using an IP address and mail server routing that was linked directly to Aaron Quinn's personal email account. The police were now convinced that this was a coordinated hoax. They believed Aaron and Denise had staged the entire thing together for some bizarre reason, perhaps for internet fame or money. This theory was seemingly confirmed on Wednesday, March 25th, when Denise Huskins suddenly appeared on her mother's doorstep in Huntington Beach, California, which is 400 miles south of Vallejo. Denise's mother was not home, so Denise walked to a neighbor's house and asked to use the phone to call her father. When the police arrived to interview her, Denise told a story that was just as crazy as Aaron's. She said she had been kept in a clean room, fed good food, allowed to shower and brush her teeth, and that her captors had been very polite. When the FBI offered to fly a private jet to Huntington Beach to bring Denise back to Vallejo to cooperate with the investigation, Denise suddenly refused to get on the plane. Instead, she hired a prominent criminal defense attorney and refused to speak to law enforcement. That night, the Vallejo Police Department held a massive, televised press conference. The police spokesperson stood before the cameras and officially declared that the kidnapping was an elaborate, orchestrated hoax. They publicly accused Aaron and Denise of wasting valuable city resources and state funds on a wild goose chase, and compared the case to the movie Gone Girl. For the next 2 months, Aaron and Denise were completely vilified by the public and the media. They lost their jobs, their reputations were destroyed, and they were constantly hounded by reporters. They insisted they were telling the truth, but absolutely nobody believed them. Until June 5, 2015. Early that morning, a police officer in the town of Dublin, California, which is about 40 miles south of Vallejo, was investigating a home invasion. A couple had woken up in the middle of the night to find a man in a wetsuit trying to tie them up. The husband had fought the intruder off, and the intruder had fled the house. But during the struggle, the intruder had dropped his cell phone on the bedroom floor. The Dublin police officer ran the diagnostics on the cell phone and traced it to a 38-year-old man named Matthew Mueller. Mueller was a former high-profile lawyer who had graduated from Harvard Law School and was also a former U.S. Marine. But in recent years, Mueller had suffered a severe mental breakdown, lost his law practice, and had begun committing bizarre, high-tech burglaries. The police obtained a search warrant for a remote, isolated cabin that Mueller was renting in South Lake Tahoe, California. When the FBI and police raided the cabin, they found Mueller inside, but as they looked around the cabin, the investigators were absolutely stunned. Scattered all over the floor amid piles of trash were black swim goggles with the lenses taped over, high-powered tactical flashlights, red laser pointers, bundles of zip ties, and a black wetsuit. They also found a video camera. When they played the video files on the camera, they found footage that Mueller had recorded of himself sexually assaulting Denise Huskins while she was tied up and blindfolded in his cabin. It turned out that every single word of Aaron and Denise's bizarre story was 100% true. Matthew Mueller was a highly intelligent, but severely psychotic and bipolar predator. He had become obsessed with Aaron and Denise and had spent 3 weeks spying on their house using a high-tech aerial drone to learn their schedules. When he broke into the house, he had acted alone, but he had used pre-recorded voices and clever positioning to make them believe there were multiple intruders. He had forced Aaron to drink a sedative and then drove Denise to his cabin in South Lake Tahoe, where he held her hostage and assaulted her before dropping her off in Huntington Beach. The reason Aaron's email was used to send the proof of life message was because Mueller had hacked into Aaron's home router and spoofed his email address to confuse the police. The Vallejo police had been so quick to judge and so eager to call the victims liars because they could not comprehend a crime so bizarre. In the aftermath of the truth coming out, Denise and Aaron filed a massive civil lawsuit against the city of Vallejo and the police department for defamation and emotional distress. They won a $2.5 million settlement. Matthew Mueller pleaded guilty to federal kidnapping charges and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was later sentenced to an additional 31 years on state charges. Against all odds, Aaron and Denise stayed together. They eventually got married, had a beautiful baby girl, and wrote a best-selling book about their terrifying ordeal and their fight for justice. On the night of November 7, 1860, a 51-year-old American politician walked inside of his modest two-story house in the city of Springfield, Illinois. The politician was completely exhausted, but he was also filled with a deep sense of happiness and relief. In his hand, he was clutching a paper telegram that had just been delivered to him. The telegram officially confirmed that he had won a highly contentious, incredibly difficult political election that he had been campaigning for over the past year. Earlier that evening, the politician had been out on the town, celebrating his historic victory with friends, supporters, and colleagues at a local hall. But now, the excitement of the night had worn off, and he was feeling the immense physical toll of the long campaign. He was ready to go to bed. The politician walked into his dark entryway, picked up a small brass oil lamp, and lit it to guide his way. He walked slowly through the quiet house to his private study. He set the warm lamp down on his wooden desk, placed the precious telegram right next to it, and then let himself collapse onto a comfortable sofa on the opposite side of the room to rest for a moment before heading upstairs. But as he lay there on his back, trying to relax, the politician happened to look across the room. Hanging on the wall directly opposite the sofa was a large, gilded mirror. The politician looked at his reflection in the glass, but as he did, he gasped and sat up quickly, his heart racing. He stared at the mirror in absolute disbelief. In the glass, he could see his own face reflected clearly, just as it should be. But right next to his reflection, there was a second face. It looked almost exactly like him, but there was something horribly wrong with it. The second face was incredibly pale, gaunt, and lifeless. It looked like a corpse, like a dead version of himself was staring back at him from the spirit world. The politician scrambled off the sofa and walked quickly over to the mirror to get a closer look, thinking his eyes were just playing tricks on him in the dim lamplight. But as soon as he stepped within a few feet of the glass, the pale, corpse-like face suddenly vanished, leaving only his normal reflection. He stood there for a long minute, looking at himself, shaking his head. He thought, okay, I am just incredibly tired. I have been working 18-hour days for months and my brain is just exhausted. I must have imagined it, feeling very unsettled, but trying to logicalize what he had seen. The politician walked back over to the sofa and lay back down in the exact same position. He looked back over at the mirror, and there they were again. Two distinct faces, his own healthy face, and right beside it, the pale, ghostly, dead reflection staring back at him. The politician jumped up from the sofa, blew out the oil lamp, and rushed out of the study. He ran upstairs to his bedroom, where his wife was already asleep in bed. He woke her up, and because his wife was a very well-known, highly devoted spiritualist who believed deeply in omens, dreams, and messages from the dead, he decided to tell her exactly what had just happened in the study. His wife sat up in bed, listening intently as her husband described the dual reflections in the mirror, especially the pale, lifeless face of the corpse. As she listened, the expression on her face changed from curiosity to absolute horror. She began to tremble. In a quiet, shaking voice, she looked at her husband and told him what the vision meant. She said that the two faces in the mirror were a powerful death omen. She interpreted that the first, healthy face meant he would successfully and honorably serve his first term in the high office he had just been elected to. The second, dead face, meant he would be re-elected to a second term, but that he would not survive to finish it. She told him he was going to die in office. The politician immediately laughed it off. He told his wife that she was being overly dramatic and superstitious, and that he had probably just been dizzy from exhaustion and seen a double refraction in the old glass of the mirror. He told her to go back to sleep and forget about it. But his wife was completely inconsolable. She threw her arms around his neck and began sobbing hysterically, as if he had just been handed a death warrant. Over the next several weeks and months, the politician's wife remained deeply terrified of the mirror omen. She constantly worried about his health and safety, and she begged him to be careful. But as time went on and nothing bad happened, her fears slowly began to fade, and the politician himself completely forgot about the strange event in his Springfield study. The politician went on to successfully serve his first term in office. He guided the country through its darkest, most difficult times. Just as the first face in the mirror had predicted, he was highly respected and he was easily re-elected to a second term. But during his second term, on the evening of April 14, 1865, the politician and his wife went out to attend a comedy play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the third act of the play, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth quietly snuck into the private theater box where the couple was sitting. He stepped up directly behind the politician, who was Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. Booth raised a single-shot pistol and shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head, mortifyingly wounding him. The president died the next morning, meaning he did not survive his second term in office, fulfilling the terrifying prophecy of the dual reflections in the Springfield mirror. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!